The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, clinking glasses, and the comforting smell of fresh bread, but at one corner table, time suddenly stopped. 8-year-old Noah tugged gently on his father's sleeve, his tiny voice barely louder than a whisper. His eyes weren't fixed on the towering cheeseburger in front of him or the fries he had begged for all week. They were locked on a young mother and her little daughter sitting across the room with nothing but 2 glasses of water between them. His innocent words cut through the noise like lightning. "Dad. They haven't eaten." The man beside him, billionaire CEO Jonathan Brooks, glanced up casually, then froze. His face turned pale as recognition crashed into him. The woman wasn't a stranger. She was someone he had spent years trying to forget, and the little girl beside her carried eyes that reminded him of a promise he had once broken. Before we continue, if you believe kindness can change lives and everyone deserves a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that stay with you long after they end. Jonathan Brooks had built one of America's largest technology companies from a tiny garage in Seattle, Washington. Newspapers called him the Miracle CEO. Investors admired him. Employees respected him. Yet none of them knew that every award hanging inside his office felt heavier than the last because success had never erased the memory of the people he left behind while chasing it. Years earlier, before the wealth, private jets, and magazine covers, Jonathan had been a struggling engineering student sharing dreams with a kind-hearted waitress named Grace Carter. They had imagined a simple life together, but when opportunity knocked, Jonathan convinced himself that love could wait while ambition could not. One painful goodbye turned into years of silence. He buried himself in work, believing that success would someday make everything right. Noah had no idea about his father's hidden past. Since losing his own mother to cancer 3 years earlier, the little boy had become unusually compassionate. Pain had taught him to notice what others ignored. While most people inside the restaurant admired Jonathan's expensive suit and luxury watch, Noah only noticed the empty plates that never arrived at Grace's table. The little girl sitting beside her, whose name was Abigail, tried to smile, pretending she wasn't hungry. She kept sipping water as though it could fill the emptiness in her stomach. Grace quietly distracted her by pointing out people walking past the large windows, hoping her daughter wouldn't ask when dinner would come. Jonathan stared across the room, unable to breathe. Grace looked older than he remembered. Life had etched exhaustion across her face, but her gentle eyes remained unchanged. She hadn't seen him yet. Her clothes were clean but worn, carefully stitched in places where fabric had torn. Jonathan suddenly realized she wasn't waiting for food. She was waiting for enough courage to leave before anyone noticed they couldn't afford a meal. Without saying a word, Noah slipped off his chair and quietly carried his untouched burger toward their table. Jonathan reached out instinctively to stop him but hesitated. Something inside him whispered that this moment wasn't about business meetings, stock prices, or reputation. It was about humanity. Grace looked up in surprise as Noah shyly placed the plate in front of Abigail. The little girl stared at the burger as though it were the greatest treasure she had ever seen. Grace immediately tried to refuse, embarrassed, but Noah simply smiled and pointed toward his father. That single gesture forced Grace's eyes to meet Jonathan's across the restaurant. The years disappeared instantly. Jonathan slowly walked toward them, each step heavier than the last. Memories flooded back, the rainy evenings they had shared cheap coffee, the tiny apartment filled with impossible dreams, and the promise he had made never to abandon her. Now, standing only a few feet away, he realized promises don't disappear simply because time passes. Grace lowered her eyes. Pride battled desperation inside her. She had spent years raising Abigail alone after losing her husband, Michael Carter, in a construction accident. Medical bills had consumed every dollar they owned. She worked 2 jobs, skipped meals regularly, and smiled every evening so her daughter would never understand how frightened she truly was. Jonathan quietly asked the waiter to bring the finest meals for both of them. Grace protested softly, but hunger had already won the argument in Abigail's eyes. Within minutes, steaming plates covered the table. Abigail whispered a thankful prayer before taking her first bite. Jonathan watched tears form in Grace's eyes as she realized her daughter was finally eating a proper meal. Noah sat beside Abigail as if they had known each other forever. Children have a remarkable gift of ignoring the walls adults spend years building. They laughed over French fries, traded stories about school, and made paper napkin airplanes while the adults remained trapped inside memories too complicated for words. Jonathan finally apologized. Not with polished speeches or excuses, but with painful honesty. He admitted that fear of failure had made him selfish. He confessed that every achievement had felt incomplete because he had walked away from someone who once believed in him before the world ever did. Grace listened quietly. Forgiveness wasn't simple. Years of struggle could never be erased by expensive dinners or heartfelt apologies. Yet she also understood something Jonathan had only recently learned. Carrying bitterness forever only deepens old wounds. Over the following weeks, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about that evening. He quietly investigated Grace's circumstances, not to control her life but to understand how he could genuinely help without taking away her dignity. He discovered she had excellent bookkeeping skills but had never been given opportunities beyond temporary jobs. Instead of offering charity, Jonathan offered respect. He invited Grace to interview for a financial coordinator position at one of his company's regional offices. She earned the job through her own abilities, surprising every executive during the interview with her intelligence and determination. For the first time in years, Grace walked into work without worrying whether she could afford groceries. Abigail received a scholarship funded anonymously through Jonathan's family foundation. Noah insisted they attend school events together, quickly becoming like brother and sister. The laughter that slowly returned to both children's lives healed wounds adults struggled to express. Months later, Jonathan stood before thousands of employees during his company's annual leadership conference. Everyone expected another speech about innovation, profits, and technology. Instead, he told a different story. He spoke about a little boy who noticed hunger while powerful adults looked away. He admitted that billion-dollar companies mean very little if success blinds people to suffering sitting only a few feet away. He reminded every executive that true leadership begins with compassion long before it reaches boardrooms. The speech spread across the country. News channels praised Jonathan's honesty, but the attention never mattered to him. What mattered was seeing Grace smile again without pretending everything was fine. What mattered was watching Abigail run across playgrounds with confidence instead of quiet worry. What mattered most was realizing his greatest teacher had been his own son. One snowy December evening, nearly a year after that unforgettable dinner, Jonathan returned to the same restaurant with Noah. This time, they reserved an extra table, not for themselves, but for families quietly struggling to afford holiday meals. Without announcements or cameras, dozens of parents and children enjoyed warm dinners paid for anonymously. As Jonathan watched grateful families laugh together, Noah leaned against him and smiled. The boy didn't ask whether they had changed the world. He simply asked whether everyone had enough to eat. Jonathan looked around the room filled with smiling children, thankful parents, and strangers helping strangers. For the first time in decades, success finally felt meaningful. If this story has touched your heart so far, please support the video by liking it, sharing it with your friends and family, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a heartfelt comment. Your support helps more inspiring stories reach people who may need hope today. Special request: before this story ends, please comment below with one word, kindness, if you believe a single act of compassion can completely change someone's life. Jonathan eventually learned that wealth isn't measured by the size of a bank account but by the number of lives touched with generosity. Grace discovered that accepting help isn't weakness when it's offered with genuine respect. Abigail grew up believing that miracles often arrive wearing ordinary clothes. And Noah never stopped noticing the people everyone else overlooked. Sometimes, history doesn't change because of billion-dollar decisions made inside towering offices. Sometimes, it changes because a child quietly whispers 6 unforgettable words that remind an entire room what it truly means to be human. And on that ordinary evening inside a restaurant in Seattle, one little boy's compassion fed far more than an empty stomach. It restored broken hearts, healed old regrets, reunited forgotten lives, and proved that the greatest inheritance a parent can leave behind is not money, but kindness.